A waitress helped a silent stranger find his way. That night, her diner was surrounded by Marines. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The neon sign of the corner booth diner was a liar. It promised warmth and welcome in glowing red script. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, scorched bacon, and the quiet desperation of a life on pause. For Sarah, this place was both her sanctuary and her cage. For 6 years, she had navigated its sticky linoleum floors, balancing plates of lukewarm food and the fragile egos of its customers. Her life was a repeating loop of filling coffee cups, wiping down counters, and forcing a smile that rarely reached her tired, blue eyes. She was an expert at reading the stories of the people who sat in her vinyl booths. The hurried businessmen trying to close a deal over a greasy burger. The young lovers whispering secrets over a shared milkshake. The lonely souls who came for the company as much as the coffee. Sarah understood loneliness. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her own existence. A feeling amplified by the ever-present stack of unpaid bills on her small kitchen table at home. Her boss, Mr. Gable, was a man who saw the world not in stories, but in numbers on a spreadsheet. He was short, balding, and possessed a perpetual scowl, as if the universe had personally offended him by not making him richer. He saw customers as revenue units and employees as depreciating assets. To him, kindness was a liability, an inefficient waste of time that could be better spent upselling a side of fries. His presence soured the air, and his frequent, cutting remarks about her speed or the cost of extra napkins were a constant reminder of her precarious position. On this particular Tuesday night, the diner was winding down. The dinner rush had been a brutal, thankless marathon, and Sarah's feet ached with a familiar, throbbing rhythm. Only a few stragglers remained, nursing their drinks under the fluorescent lights. She was mechanically wiping down the chrome counter, her mind already drifting toward the solace of her small, quiet apartment, when the bell above the door chimed. The sound was different this time, not the cheerful jingle of a new customer, but a hesitant, almost apologetic whisper. The man who entered seemed to be made of shadows and silence. He was elderly, with a tall, wiry frame that was slightly stooped, not from age, but from a weight that seemed to be pressing down on his soul. He wore a simple, worn jacket that might have once been military issue, its olive drab faded to a nondescript gray. His face was a roadmap of hardship, carved with deep lines, but his eyes were the most striking feature. They were a pale, clouded blue, and they seemed to be looking at something far beyond the walls of the diner, lost in a landscape of memory only he could see. He didn't speak. He simply stood by the door, clutching a tattered, folded map in one hand, looking utterly and profoundly lost. Mr. Gable saw the man, and his expression curdled instantly. From his perch on a stool behind the cash register, he jabbed a thumb in the stranger's direction. "Sarah, get rid of him," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "We're not a shelter. He'll scare off the regulars." Sarah looked from her boss's sneering face to the old man, who hadn't moved an inch. He was just standing there, a silent statue of disorientation. There was something about him that tugged at a forgotten corner of her heart. It was his posture. Beneath the weariness, there was an ingrained straightness to his back, a hint of discipline that reminded her of her grandfather, a man who had also come back from a war with a quietness he could never explain and a ramrod spine he could never relax. The thought was a flicker of warmth in the cold, transactional space of the diner. She ignored Gable's order, her lips tightening into a thin line of defiance. She untied her apron, a small, symbolic act of stepping out of her role, and walked slowly toward the stranger. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft. The man didn't seem to hear her. His gaze remained distant, his focus entirely on the creased map in his hand. She moved closer into his line of sight. "Sir," she repeated gently. He blinked, and for a moment, his pale eyes focused on her. There was no recognition, no understanding, just a deep, bottomless well of confusion. He lifted the hand holding the map, a slight tremor in his fingers, and pointed to a spot on the paper. He didn't speak, but the gesture was a clear, desperate question. Where am I? How do I get there? Gable's voice cut through the quiet moment like a shard of glass. Sarah, I told you to get him out of here. Now. The few remaining customers looked up from their plates. Their curiosity piqued. The air grew tense. Sarah felt a familiar flush of anger and humiliation rise in her cheeks. She turned to face her boss, her voice low but firm. He's just lost, Mr. Gable. He's not bothering anyone. He's bothering me. Gable shot back, sliding off his stool. This is a place of business. If he's not buying, he's leaving. It's that simple. Get him out, or I will. He took a menacing step forward. The old man, oblivious to the drama swirling around him, continued to stare at his map. His world shrunk to that single piece of paper. Sarah had made a split-second decision. It was a choice born of empathy, of a stubborn refusal to let the world be as cruel as Mr. Gable wanted it to be. She stepped between her boss and the stranger, creating a small, human shield. He'll have a coffee, she said, looking Gable dead in the eye. And a slice of the apple pie. Put it on my tab. The defiance in her tone was unmistakable. It was a line drawn in the grease-stained linoleum. Gable's face darkened with rage, but the eyes of the other customers were on him. He couldn't make a scene without looking like a monster. With a low growl of frustration, he retreated to his stool, his glare promising a reckoning later. Sarah turned back to the old man and gently touched his arm. Come on, let's get you a seat. She guided him to a small booth in the corner, a place where he could have some privacy. He moved with a slow, shuffling gait, allowing her to lead him as if he were a child. She sat him down, and he immediately unfolded the map on the table, his entire being consumed by it once more. Sarah brought the coffee and pie and set them gently on the table in front of the silent stranger. The coffee was black and steaming, a small beacon of warmth in the cool diner. The slice of pie, with its flaky crust and cinnamon-dusted apples, was the kind of simple comfort food she had served 1,000 times. But the man didn't seem to notice it. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the food. His long, bony fingers traced the faded lines on his map, a silent, desperate pilgrimage across a landscape of paper. His single-minded focus was both heartbreaking and unnerving. Sarah watched him from the counter, her earlier defiance now mingling with a growing sense of responsibility. Mr. Gable radiated hostility from across the room, his pen tapping an angry rhythm against his order pad, a metronome counting down the minutes until he could unleash his fury on her. She tried to busy herself, refilling salt shakers and wiping down menus, but her eyes kept being drawn back to the corner booth. She observed the details of the man, the small things that didn't quite fit the simple, vagrant label Gable had slapped on him. His clothes were worn and frayed, but they were clean. His hands were weathered and scarred, the hands of someone who had known hard labor or harder things, but his fingernails were trimmed and neat. And clutched in his other hand, the one not tracing the map, was a small, thin chain. Peeking out from his fist, she could see the glint of a single, worn dog tag. He held it like a rosary, a talisman against the confusing world he found himself in. Curiosity finally won out over her fear of Gable. She poured herself a cup of coffee and walked over to his booth, sliding into the seat opposite him. Is there someone I can call for you? She asked softly, hoping to break through his wall of silence. He didn't respond, but his fingers stopped moving on the map. He tapped it once, a single, deliberate tap on a specific location. Sarah leaned in to see. It was a local map, and his finger was resting on a small green patch on the outskirts of town. She recognized it immediately. The military cemetery? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. For the first time, the man looked up at her. His clouded blue eyes seemed to clear for just a fraction of a second, and in them, she saw a flicker of desperate confirmation. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement of his head. Then, as quickly as it came, the connection was gone. His gaze drifted away again, back to the abstract lines on the paper, the wall of his inner world closing around him once more. A wave of profound sadness washed over Sarah. He wasn't just lost in the city. He was lost in time, trying to find his way back to a place of memory, a place of ghosts. Mr. Gable's voice shattered the fragile moment. Sarah, you've got a spill on table 4. Stop harassing the customers and do your job. The word harassing was a deliberate, cruel jab. Sarah flinched as if struck. She slid out of the booth, her face burning with a mixture of anger and helplessness. As she walked away, the old man remained in his silent world, the untouched coffee growing cold beside his map to a place he couldn't reach. Sarah's shift officially ended at 10 p.m. The last of the paying customers had trickled out, leaving only the silent stranger in the corner booth and the simmering rage of her boss. As she was untying her apron for the second time that night, her movements slow with exhaustion, Gable cornered her by the kitchen doors. I'm not paying you to run a soup kitchen for every bum that wanders in off the street, he snarled, his face unpleasantly close to hers. That slice of pie, that coffee, that's coming out of your pay. And I'll tell you something else. I'm coming in to open tomorrow at 6. If he, Gable jerked his head toward the old man, is still sitting in that booth, don't bother clocking in. Don't bother coming back at all. Understood? The threat was bald and ugly. Her job, her only source of income, was hanging by the thread of this stranger's presence. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her fatigue. She should just go home. She should lock the door, leave the man to his fate, and pray he would be gone by morning. It was the sensible thing to do, the self-preserving thing to do. She grabbed her purse and her worn jacket and walked to the front door, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She cast one last look at the old man. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at his map, the untouched food a silent testament to a hunger that was not for the body. She could see the entrance to the military cemetery on his map. It was at least 5 miles from the diner, a long, dark stretch of highway with no sidewalks. He couldn't walk there. Not at night. Not in his condition. Sarah stood by the door, her hand on the handle, her mind a battlefield. On one side was Gable's threat, the stack of bills, the fear of eviction. On the other was the image of her grandfather's sad eyes and the sight of this lost, silent man trying to find his way to his ghosts. In that moment, something inside her shifted. It was a quiet rebellion, a decision that her own humanity was worth more than a dead-end job working for a heartless tyrant. She let go of the door handle. She walked back to the corner booth, her steps now firm with a new, terrifying resolve. Sir, she said, her voice clear and steady. The man looked up, his eyes as vacant as before. She pointed to the spot on the map, the cemetery. I can take you there, she said. It's too far to walk. I have a car. I can give you a ride. He stared at her, and she could see a flicker of a struggle behind his eyes, a war between deep-seated confusion and a primal instinct to trust or not to trust. He looked down at the map, then back at her. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to fold the map with his trembling fingers. He then gave a single, slow nod. Relief and terror washed over Sarah in equal measure. She had made her choice. She was taking this stranger, this silent enigma, out into the night, and she had no idea where this path would lead, except, perhaps, straight to the unemployment line. The drive was steeped in a silence that was heavier than any conversation could have been. Sarah's old sedan, usually a familiar and comforting space, felt charged with the presence of the stranger in the passenger seat. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap, the folded map clutched in one, the dog tag in the other. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, his gaze fixed on the ribbon of dark asphalt unspooling before them, illuminated by the car's weak headlights. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional swish of a passing car, each one a fleeting reminder of a world that was moving on while they were suspended in this strange, timeless bubble. Sarah's mind, however, was anything but silent. A frantic chorus of what-ifs played on a loop in her head. What was she doing? She was driving a man she didn't know, a man who couldn't or wouldn't speak, to a cemetery in the middle of the night. She was actively defying her boss, effectively throwing away her job, the one thing that stood between her and financial ruin. Every rational instinct screamed at her to turn the car around, to drop him back at the diner, and run home to lock her doors. But she couldn't. Some deeper, More stubborn instinct kept her foot on the gas pedal. She glanced over at him. In the intermittent glow of the streetlights, his profile was stark and noble, like a figure carved from stone. The deep lines on his face seemed to hold 1,000 stories he would never tell. She thought again of her grandfather, of the silence he had brought back with him from his war. He had never been able to share what he had seen, and the weight of it had eventually crushed him. Perhaps this man's silence was the same, a vault of memories too heavy to be opened. As they left the main thoroughfare and turned onto the quieter, darker road that led to the cemetery, the world outside the car seemed to fall away. Tall, skeletal trees lined the road, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers toward the sky. The air grew colder. Sarah shivered, though not from the temperature. She felt a profound sense of trespassing, as if she were entering a place she didn't belong. Finally, a pair of tall, wrought iron gates appeared in her headlights. A simple, elegant sign read, Oakwood National Military Cemetery. The gates were closed and chained, a heavy padlock glinting in the light. They were locked for the night. Sarah pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder and put in park. "We're here," she said softly. It's closed." The man didn't seem to register her words. He simply opened the car door and got out. He walked slowly to the gate, his steps measured and deliberate. He wrapped his long, bony fingers around the cold iron bars and stood there, staring into the darkness beyond. The cemetery was a vast, silent city of the dead, rows upon rows of identical white headstones barely visible in the faint moonlight, stretching away into the gloom. He wasn't looking for a specific grave. He was looking at all of them. His shoulders began to shake, a silent, racking grief that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. He made no sound, but the depth of his sorrow was a palpable force in the cold night air. Sarah's heart broke. She got out of the car and walked over to him, not knowing what to do or say. Words felt useless here. She reached into the back of her car and pulled out a thin, worn blanket she kept for emergencies. She walked up behind him and gently draped it over his trembling shoulders. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. He simply continued to stare into the darkness, a lonely sentinel at the gates of his past. Sarah stood beside him for what felt like an eternity, a silent witness to his private agony, before realizing there was nothing more she could do. She had brought him to his destination, but she couldn't open the gate for him. With a final, sorrowful look, she got back in her car and drove away, leaving him wrapped in her blanket, a solitary figure keeping vigil under the cold, unpitying stars. The drive back to the diner was a blur of conflicting emotions. Sarah felt a profound sense of failure, as if she had abandoned a child at the gates of an orphanage. Leaving him there, alone in the dark, felt like an act of profound cruelty, even though she didn't know what else she could have done. The image of his shaking shoulders, his silent grief, was seared into her mind. Mingled with the sorrow was the cold, practical dread of her own situation. She had crossed a line with Gable. There would be no going back. The thought of facing him in the morning, of the inevitable, humiliating firing, made her stomach churn. Instead of going home to her empty apartment, she found herself driving back to the one place that felt like solid ground, however shaky, the corner booth. She unlocked the door and stepped back into the familiar, stale air. The diner was dark and quiet, a ghost of its daytime self. The old man's uneaten pie and cold coffee were still sitting in the corner booth, a small, sad memorial to the night's events. Sarah couldn't rest. Her mind was a whirlwind of anxiety. She started cleaning, the mindless, repetitive tasks a small comfort against the chaos in her head. She scrubbed the grill, refilled the napkin dispensers, mopped the floor. She was working on autopilot, trying to outrun her thoughts, when the headlights of a car swept across the front windows, followed by the familiar rumble of a police cruiser. A moment later, Deputy Hank Miller walked in. Hank was a regular, a kind, middle-aged man with a weary smile and a comforting presence. He often stopped by for a late-night coffee to break the monotony of his patrol. "Burning the midnight oil, Sarah?" he asked, easing himself onto a stool at the counter. "Couldn't sleep," she said, forcing a weak smile as she poured him a coffee. Long night. Tell me about it. Hank sighed, taking a sip. Got half the county out looking for a missing person. An old-timer wandered off from the VA hospital up in Northwood this afternoon. Dementia's setting in, poor guy. Sarah froze, the coffee pot still in her hand. A missing person? She asked, her voice suddenly tight. An old man? Hank nodded, pulling a folded flyer from his pocket and sliding it across the counter. Yeah, here's the APB. Tall fella, gray hair, might be wearing an old Army-style jacket. Name's Thomas Rafferty. Apparently, he's a pretty decorated vet. A real hero, they said. It's a damn shame. Sarah stared at the flyer. The picture was a grainy, black-and-white photo from years ago, but there was no mistaking the man's features, the set of his jaw, the piercing eyes. It was him, the silent stranger. Thomas Rafferty. He wasn't just a lost vagrant. He was a missing patient, a vulnerable person who needed help. And she had left him alone, in the dark, at a locked cemetery miles from anywhere. A wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over her. Hank, she said, her voice trembling. I think I saw him. She quickly recounted the story of the man's arrival, his map, his silence. Hank listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. When she got to the part about leaving him at the cemetery, Hank's eyes widened. You left him at Oakwood? He asked, already reaching for his radio. Sarah, you need to tell me everything right now. Before she could say another word, the sound began. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration she felt in the floor more than she heard with her ears. It wasn't the sound of Hank's radio or a passing truck. It was the sound of multiple heavy vehicles, moving in unison, and they were getting closer. The low hum rapidly intensified into a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the diner. It was a sound of disciplined power, completely alien to the quiet, pre-dawn world of the highway. Sarah and Hank exchanged a look of bewildered alarm. Hank pushed himself away from the counter and moved to the front window, peering out into the darkness. What in the world is that? He muttered. The source of the sound appeared in a sudden, blinding flood of light. A convoy of vehicles was turning into the diner's parking lot, moving with a speed and precision that was unnerving. They were not police cars or civilian trucks. They were matte black vans and a larger, olive-drab transport vehicle, the kind she had only ever seen in movies about the military. They fanned out across the lot, their headlights cutting sharp, white beams through the darkness, illuminating the shabby diner in a harsh, interrogating glare. They strategically blocked the entrance and exit, their positioning deliberate and tactical. The entire parking lot, which moments before had been a dark, empty expanse of cracked asphalt, was now a secured, military-style staging area. Doors opened in silent unison, and figures began to emerge. They were not police officers. They were Marines. Some were in full combat gear, helmets on, rifles held in a low-ready position, their movements economical and purposeful as they established a silent, watchful perimeter. Others were in immaculate dress blue uniforms, the iconic formal attire of the Marine Corps, their white hats and gloves stark against the darkness. The scene was so surreal, so utterly out of place, that Sarah felt a sense of dizzying disbelief. It was like a dream, a strange, high-stakes fever dream playing out in the familiar, mundane setting of the corner booth. Hank stood by the window, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, his face a mask of stunned confusion. As a local deputy, he was used to being the highest authority on the scene. Now, he was just a spectator to an operation that was clearly far beyond his pay grade. The main door of the diner opened, and two of the Marines in dress blues entered. They were tall, imposing figures, their faces young but etched with a seriousness that made them seem older. They didn't speak. They simply took up positions on either side of the doorway, standing at a formal parade rest. They were an honor guard, sentries at the threshold of what had suddenly become a very important place. A moment later, a third figure entered. He was an older man, his hair a distinguished silver, his posture so straight it seemed carved from granite. The eagles on the shoulders of his uniform identified him as a colonel. His chest was a dazzling tapestry of ribbons, a silent, colorful history of a life lived in service and conflict. His face was stern, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, held a deep, weary concern. He surveyed the diner, his gaze sweeping over the booths, the counter, and finally settling on Sarah and Hank. The sheer, overwhelming authority he projected filled the small space, silencing the hum of the coffee machine and the buzz of the fluorescent lights. The world had shrunk to this single, tense moment. Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the disciplined silence of the Marines. She had a terrifying premonition that the lost old man, the silent stranger she had tried to help, was the reason for all of this. The Marine colonel walked toward the counter, his polished black shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, the air crackling around him. He stopped a few feet from where Sarah and Hank stood, his presence commanding the small space with an intensity that was almost physical. He addressed Hank first, a nod of professional courtesy from one uniformed officer to another. "Deputy," he said, his voice a calm, low baritone. "Colonel Marcus Thorne, United States Marine Corps. Thank you for your assistance." Hank, visibly relieved to be acknowledged, managed a nod. "Colonel, we just got the APB." Colonel Thorne's gaze then shifted to Sarah. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, his stern features relaxing into a look of focused inquiry. "Ma'am," he began, "Deputy Miller informed us that you may have had contact with a missing person we're looking for. An elderly gentleman. We have reason to believe he is a former Marine named Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Rafferty." He produced a small, laminated photograph from his jacket pocket. It was the same photo from the APB, showing a much younger Thomas Rafferty, his gaze proud and steady, a formal portrait from another era. "Is this the man you saw tonight?" Sarah stared at the photograph, her throat tight. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, that's him." Just as she spoke, the back door of the diner slammed open, and Mr. Gable stormed in, his face a mask of pure fury. He had clearly driven up and seen the military vehicles and assumed the worst: a robbery, a police raid, something that would be bad for business. He didn't seem to notice the gravity of the situation, his world too small to accommodate anything beyond his own petty grievances. His eyes, blind to the colonel's rank and the honor guard at the door, zeroed in on Sarah. "What is going on here?" he shrieked, his voice piercing the tense silence. "I knew it. I knew that bum you let in here was trouble. Is this what happens? You give a handout to some vagrant, and suddenly we have a police situation? I hope you're happy, Sarah, because you are." Gable's tirade was cut short as Colonel Thorne turned his head slowly to face him. The colonel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was enough. It was a look of such pure, undiluted contempt that Gable's words caught in his throat. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees. "You were saying, sir?" the colonel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Gable, finally sensing the immense, unspoken power he was confronting, began to stammer. This is my establishment. And that man, he was a vagrant, a transient. She let him loiter for hours." Colonel Thorne took a half step toward Gable, and the shorter man flinched back involuntarily. "That vagrant," the colonel said, each word a perfectly enunciated drop of ice, "is Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Rafferty. He is a decorated hero of this nation, and the trouble he has caused is that he has gotten lost, a state of affairs that can happen to even the bravest of men when they grow old and their minds begin to betray them. And you, sir, in your establishment saw not a man in need, but a bum." The colonel's gaze was withering. "I would advise you to choose your next words very, very carefully." Gable stared, his mouth agape, his face draining of all color. The small, petty tyrant of the corner booth had just come face to face with true, absolute authority, and it had left him speechless and terrified. The colonel let his words hang in the air, a devastating indictment of Gable's character. The diner was so quiet you could hear the frantic, panicked beat of Gable's heart. He stood rooted to the spot, his face a pasty white. The bully suddenly transformed into a trembling, cornered animal. Colonel Thorne turned his back on him, a gesture of complete and utter dismissal, and focused his attention once more on Sarah. The shift in his demeanor was profound. The icy contempt vanished, replaced by a look of urgent, respectful concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice regaining its gentle, baritone calm. "You said you saw him. Can you tell us where he went? It is imperative that we find him. He is diabetic and has missed his medication." The news hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Not only had she left a confused, elderly hero alone in the dark, but she had left a sick man who needed medical attention. The weight of her guilt intensified. "The cemetery," she said, her voice shaking. He had a map. He kept pointing to the Oakwood Military Cemetery. "I drove him there. The gates were locked, but I left him there. I gave him my blanket. I didn't know what else to do." A flicker of relief crossed the colonel's face. "You drove him there? You gave him a blanket?" He looked at her with a newfound respect. "Ma'am, you showed him a kindness and dignity that, it seems, is in short supply in this establishment." He shot a brief, cutting glance over his shoulder at the still frozen gable. "You did more than you know. You got him to the one place he was trying to go. He is safe." He turned to one of the young Marines standing by the door. "Lieutenant, get a team to the Oakwood Cemetery, main gate. He'll be there. Bring him home." The lieutenant nodded sharply. "Aye, sir." He spoke quietly into the radio on his shoulder, and within seconds, the rumble of engines outside signaled that a vehicle was detaching from the convoy and speeding away into the night. Colonel Thorne then delved deeper, his voice a mixture of professional inquiry and genuine awe. "Gunnery Sergeant Rafferty," he explained, his voice resonating with pride, "is something of a legend in the Corps. He served in 2 wars. At the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, as a young private, he held off an entire enemy platoon by himself for a full night to protect his wounded comrades. For that, he received the Navy Cross, our second highest award for valor." He paused, letting the weight of the information sink in. "He's a titan, one of our giants. The new barracks at Camp Lejeune is being named after him next month. He was at the VA for a pre-ceremony checkup when he wandered. He gets confused sometimes. He thinks he needs to go check on his men." His eyes grew distant. "The cemetery, that's where many of them are buried." He was going to stand watch. The story filled the shabby diner with a sense of history and sacrifice that was almost overwhelming. Sarah looked at the corner booth where the silent old man had sat, and she saw him now not as a lost soul, but as a king, a warrior who had carried the weight of his fallen soldiers for a lifetime. Gable, meanwhile, finally processed the information, and his terror was swiftly replaced by a greasy, opportunistic obsequiousness. He scurried forward. "A hero! My goodness! I had no idea. If I had known, I would have. I would have given him anything he wanted. On the house, of course. Sarah should have told me." The colonel turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes narrowing to glacial slits. "She tried to tell you, sir," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "She told you he was a man who needed help, but you were too busy calculating the cost of a slice of pie." The colonel's final, damning words silenced Gable completely. There was no excuse, no escape. His own petty greed and callousness had been laid bare under the harsh, fluorescent lights of his own diner, exposed for all to see. He shrank back, his face a mottled mixture of fear and shame, finally understanding the chasm between his world of profit margins and the world of honor and sacrifice that had just walked through his door. A few minutes later, the lieutenant's voice crackled over the colonel's radio. "Sir, we have him. He's safe. A little cold, but he's okay. He was right at the gate, wrapped in a blanket, just like the ladies said." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the diner. The tension that had been wound so tight finally began to ease. Colonel Thorne nodded, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "Good work, Lieutenant. Bring him back to the VA. And tell the gunny. Tell him his men are secure. He can stand down." "Aye, aye, sir." The radio crackled back. "Will do." The colonel turned to Sarah, and the look in his eyes was one of profound gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, and on behalf of every man who ever served with Gunny Rafferty, thank you. You treated him with honor when you had no reason to. You saw a human being in distress, and you acted with compassion. That is a form of courage all its own." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet. He extracted several $100 bills and placed them on the counter. "This is for his meal, for your time, and for the blanket." Sarah pushed the money back toward him. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I can't take that. It was my honor." The colonel looked at her, then at the money, and nodded in understanding. He put the bills away. Instead, he took out a simple white business card. "Very well," he said. "Then take this. That's my direct line. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. The Marine Corps pays its debts." He then turned to Hank. "Deputy, thank you for your professionalism." Finally, he cast one last, withering look at Mr. Gable, who seemed to have shrunk several inches. The colonel didn't say another word to him. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. With a final, respectful nod to Sarah, Colonel Thorne turned and strode out of the diner, his honor guard falling in his step beside him. Within moments, the parking lot was empty. The flashing lights were gone. The rumble of engines faded into the distance. The silence that returned was different. It was clean. It was peaceful. Sarah, Hank, and a deeply humiliated Mr. Gable were left in the sudden stillness. Gable looked at Sarah, his face a wreck of emotions. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to fire her, but no words came out. He simply turned and shuffled into his back office, closing the door behind him, a defeated man. The next evening, something remarkable happened. The bell on the diner door began to jingle, and it didn't stop. Car after car pulled into the parking lot. The diner filled up, every booth, every counter stool. But these weren't the usual customers. They were Marines, young men and women in civilian clothes, their posture straight, their gazes clear and direct. The word had apparently spread through the local base. They came for coffee, for burgers, for pie. They were polite, they were respectful, and they all made a point of leaving a generous tip. They didn't mention the events of the previous night, but they didn't have to. Their presence was a statement. It was a silent, powerful thank you. It was the Marine Corps, in its own quiet way, paying its debt. Sarah moved through the crowded diner, her heart full. She was no longer just a tired waitress in a dead-end job. She was a woman who had chosen kindness over fear, and in doing so, had been welcomed into a world of honor she never knew existed. The narrator's voice comes in, full of warmth. In the quiet corners of the world, we are tested, not in grand battles, but in small moments. The choice to help a stranger, to offer a kindness with no expectation of reward. Sarah didn't know she was helping a hero. She just knew she was helping a man. And in that simple, powerful act, she found her own strength, her own honor. The corner booth was still just a diner on the side of a highway, but it was no longer a cage. It had become a testament to the fact that true greatness can walk through any door, and that the most important thing we can do is be ready to meet it with an open heart.